Welcome back. In this step, we would start looking at entities. In the previous step, we had set up a simple project. There are things which we need to still understand about that project. We'll understand them as we go. And now let's focus on creating a simple entity. What we want to do is to create an entity called user. Let's create a simple class. So class, name it as user. I would want to store it in a separate package. I would want to just say is entity and say finish. Now you'd see that the user is created in a package called entity. That's cool. So this is where we would store all our entities. This is the package where we would put all our entities in, and user is an example entity. What we want to have is a few attributes in the user. So I would say first thing is an ID. So I'll say instead of public, actually it should be private long ID. And I would want to store a couple of attributes of the user: private string name and private string role. One thing you need to understand is this is not really perfect design, because a name might have first name, last name, and other stuff. So you might really need to actually have a class called name. Ideally, you would want to have an enum defining that. Let's keep things simple for now. So let's just have strings, and I would also generate the getters and setters and stuff like that. So what I'll do is right click, source, and say generate getters and setters. I would only want getters, so I'll say select getters and say OK. I will also create a toString. So right click source, generate toString, and say OK. It would generate a toString method for us. And also what I'll try and do is to generate a simple constructor. So generate constructor using fields. Ideally, we will not use an ID field in the constructor. So I'll remove the ID. I'll use the other fields. So we have a constructor in here. It's a simple constructor. 2 parameters, name and role. One of the things that JPA expects in every class is a default constructor. So if we create a constructor like this, then we are overriding the default constructor which is provided. JPA expects a default constructor, so let's go ahead and define a simple default constructor as well. So this is just like a simple bean. There is nothing JPA specific in it right now. It's a simple bean. It has 3 attributes: ID, name and role. It has a simple constructor accepting name and role, and it has a couple of getters and a toString method. This is very similar to any bean that you define. There is nothing JPA specific in here. So now I would want to take this user and I would want to store it to a table called user in the database. So I would want to actually take the data from user and be able to map it to a table. How do I do that? Then I would need to make this an entity. So if I want to be able to store this user to a table, then what we need to do is we need to define an annotation. So that's at entity. As we discussed earlier, we are going to use the javax.persistence. javax.persistence is the package where Java persistence API annotations are present. So I'll use javax.persistence entity. You can see that that's imported in here. So entity specifies that a class is an entity. This is something which should be persisted to a database. What we'll do is we'll also want to say this is a primary key. How do I say this is a primary key? By using another annotation called @id. user has a primary key called ID. This becomes the primary key. One of the things I would want to do is I don't really want to assign the primary key. So I would want this to be generated. How do I make this to be generated? By saying it's a generated value. I'm adding an annotation saying this is a generated value. So until now, we have created a simple entity called user. We added an annotation called entity, and we added a couple of annotations on the ID field, ID and generated value, to say that this is something which is generated. Once we have created an entity, we would need to be able to save this to a database. How do we store entities to the database and get them from the database? The way we would do that is by using something called a entity manager. In the next step, we would start defining a service to get these values from the database. In the last step, we defined a simple entity. We would want to be able to save this entity to the database. What we would need to use? We would need to use an entity manager. To be able to save this user entity to the database, I'll create something called a user service. So let's say new class. We would want to call it user DAO service. So we are creating this a DAO service in the sense that it's a data access object. So this is something which helps us access data from the database. So that's why I'm calling it user DAO service. I'm clicking finish. One of the things is I would want to move this to a package instead of .steps. I would want to actually create it in a service package. What I've done is I've moved the user DAO service to the package JPA in 10 steps service. So now we have this class, and in this class we would want to be able to manage user entity. We would want to be able to save users and retrieve users from the database. One of the first things that we would need to do to be able to get the values from the database is create an instance of an entity manager. So I'll create a private entity manager. I'll import JavaX persistence entity manager. With this entity manager, I would want to be able to save data to the database. So I'll create a save method, public long insert, and this would accept a user and save the user down to the database. Let's import the user. How do I save an entity to the database? User is an entity, right? There is an annotation at entity defined on it. How do I save it? Entity manager provides a method. So entity manager dot persist. Persist is the method which can be used to make an instance managed and persistent. I'll say persist, and what we want to do is once the user is persisted, we want to return the ID of the created one. So user dot get ID. This user DAO interface is something which helps us store things to the database. In Spring, we call that kind of components as a repository. So a repository is an annotation which is defined in Spring framework. So you can look at it or Spring framework stereotype. Repository indicates something which interacts with the database. The other thing is when we want to insert, we want to modify something to the database, you need to be inside a transaction. What we would need to do is we need to be able to do something like open transaction here, open transaction, make the change, whatever changes that you need to do, and then close the transaction. Instead of implementing transaction management in each method, what JPA provides is a simple interface to do declarative transaction management. The way we can do that is by saying transactional. So you can use this annotation on the class as well as on the methods. We are using javax.transactional. That's the thing which is imported in. So this says each method would be involved in a transaction. Other important thing that we need to understand is the concept of a persistence context and how it relates with the entity manager. If I say user Jack is equal to new user Jack admin, it creates an instance of the user. Here I'm creating another instance Jill. I'm saying entity manager dot persist Jack. So now Jack is something which is managed by the entity manager. Entity manager is actually an interface to the persistence context. When I say something that persists Jack, what it does is it saves it to the database and also starts tracking it in the persistence context. Jack is now inside the persistence context. So whatever changes I make to the Jack are now being tracked by the persistence context. Important thing to understand is entity manager only tracks those objects which are persisted through it. So here I'm creating something called Jill, and Jill, I'm not doing anything with the entity manager to Jill, and I'm saying Jill.set role, changing the role of Jill. This will not be tracked by the entity manager. Only those things which are in the persistence context are tracked by the entity manager. So we need to put an annotation so that this is auto-wired. So what is the annotation? It's persistence context. So I'm going to use an JavaX annotation. JavaX persistence annotation, persistence context. This is cool, right? So I have a service which is having a simple method called insert to save the user. Now I would want to be able to call this and be able to save this data down to the database. Let's do that in the next step. In the previous steps, we defined an entity called user and we created a DAO service to manage this entity. I would want to be able to call this DAO service at some place. One of the things that we have already set up is a simple project which launches up a Spring context. So this project, because we created using Spring Boot and uses a Spring Boot starter, this is already starting something called a Spring context. What we can do is at the launch of this Spring context, we would want to insert a user in. How do we do that? There's a concept called command line runner. So these command line runners are typically executed when the context launches up, when the Spring context launches up. You don't really need to worry about the context stuff right now. All that you need to remember is the fact that this command line runner launches up when the application starts up. So whenever we start the application, the code in the command line runner gets executed. Let's create a simple command line runner. I'll call this new class user because I'm talking to the service. So I'll say user DAO service command line runner. This command line runner, I would want it to be managed by Spring. So I'll say add component and import. To make it a command line runner, I need to implement an interface. So the interface, as you can guess, is command line runner. So I can import the command line runner in. Now I have to implement a method called run. So I would want to implement the run method inside the command line runner. Inside this run method, I would want to be able to save the user. So I would want to be able to say user is equal to new user of Jack. I would want to give him a role of admin. I would import the user in, and I would want to be able to do a persist for this. I would want to be able to save him to the database. How do I save him? I would need the user DAO service. I'll say user DAO service. I've created a simple instance of the user DAO service. I would want Spring to auto-wire it in. I'm saying import auto-wired. That's cool. I would want this user data service, user DAO service, to save this data. So how do I do that? Insert user. One of the important things is the fact that the user DAO service also returns the ID back. So what I'll do is I would want to log this ID. So I would want to log the ID which was created. To be able to log it, I would need a logger. So what I've done is I've used the logger factory.getLogger for this specific class. Actually, it should be here. So it's user DAO service command line runner class. I'm getting the logger. I'm using SLF for J here. So I'm going to use SLF for J. We created a simple logger so we can log this stuff out. So now I would say log.info, and I would say new user is created plus user. Okay, let's take a quick look back at what we are doing. So we implemented the command line runner interface because we would want this to run at the launch of the application. We added in a user DAO service because that's what allows us to insert a user. We created a user, we called insert user, and we are logging it. That's basically what we have done until now. Let's launch the application and see what happens. Right click, run as Java application. If you get a port conflict, what you need to make sure is that you kill the earlier instance which was running. I've already killed that instance and started a new one now. So let's see what happens. It's starting up, and one of the things that you would see at the startup in the log is the fact that it prints a new user. So new user is created, user ID is equal to this. So this is present in the log. So what we are able to do now is we are able to successfully save something down to the database. The thing which you need to understand here is the fact that we have not really created a database yet. How is this magic happening? Where is this data really getting stored to? Where is the database present? Do not worry about that. We'll look at it and more in the next step. Until now, what we have created is very simple, right? We have created a simple entity called user. We have created a service called user DAO service to be able to manage the user. And we are calling DAO service in the command line runner. So at the launch of the application, we are calling the service to be able to store the user in. And we saw that the user was created fine. This is a lot of magic that is happening. What's the magic that is happening in the background? That's basically what we would look at in the next step. In the previous steps, we created entity, we created a DAO service, and we created a command line runner to be able to save the data down to the database. However, there were a lot of unanswered questions. The first one is, where is the database created? What schema is used to create the tables? Where are the tables created? And so on and so forth. In this step, let's answer all those questions. The simple answer is all the magic is happening because of Spring Boot and its startup projects. Let's open up our pom.xml. When we created this project using Spring Initializer at start.spring.io, we chose three important dependencies. We chose web, we chose a starter called starter data JPA, and we chose H2 as the database. Let's focus on the in-memory database first. That's H2. Typically, we are used to databases like MySQL, Oracle. For all those kind of databases, you need to first install them on your machine, then create the tables, and then you'll be able to save the data from the application. This would mean that there is a lot of setup involved. Other kind of databases called in-memory databases. These databases are directly created inside the application. The schemas are defined, the tables are created, the data is populated, and once the application stops, the entire database is destroyed and removed from memory. The great thing about these databases is you don't really need to maintain them. I don't really need to install manually. I don't need to install the tables in there and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to application.properties. This is where we can configure the Spring Boot application. And what I would want to do is spring.jpa.show SQL. I'm making it true. So I would want to show the SQL which is generated, and the other setting I would want to turn on is something called spring.h2.console.enabled is equal to true. So I would want to see the SQL which is generated, and I would also want to enable something called H2 console. Let's stop the application and start it again. There are a few important things that you would see. You would see that there's a sequence being created and a table being created as well. There's a sequence called Hibernate sequence and the table called user being created. The other thing you would see is that there is an insert into user name role ID. These are the queries which are being executed. I can see them now because I turned on logging for queries. I said spring.jpa.showSQL true. We can see that the table is created and the data is inserted into it. Can I see the data in the database? One of the important things that you need to note is the URL is localhost 8080/h2 console. So it's h2-console, localhost 8080 h2 console, and you need to use a DB URL of jdbc h2 mem test db. So jdbc h2 mem test db. So I'm going to h2 console. You can leave these as a default. So we want to connect to the generic h2 embedded, and this is the jdbc URL. So we are putting a JDBC URL of jdbc h2 mem test db, and I'm saying connect. And now you can see the database. You can see the user table. The user table is created, ID, name, and role. I can do a select star from it. So I'm doing a select star from it, and you can see the row which is inserted in. What I would recommend you to do is to play around with this. We saw that the database is created in memory using H2. We saw that the schema also is being created at application startup, and also we saw the tables which were created. We saw the data in the database as well. Even then, a couple of important questions remain. Who is creating the data source? How is this schema being generated? Answer to all that is Spring Boot and the auto configuration of Spring Boot. So the entire magic is done by Spring Boot auto configuration. To be able to understand Spring Boot auto configuration much more, what we'll do is we'll turn on debug logging. Logging.level for org.spring framework. So for Spring Framework, I'm turning on logging level to be debug. That's basically what we are doing in here. And let's restart the application. If you look at the log now, because we turned on debug logging, you'd see a lot more logging. There is something called an auto configuration report which is printed. I'll extract a few things from here. Here is a quick preview of what we observed in the log. One of the things is Spring Boot is intelligent. It identifies if you are connecting to an in-memory database or not. Since it saw that there is H2 on the dependencies list, it has configured an in-memory database H2. You're using H2 in-memory database. So Spring Boot knows that if you're using an in-memory database, then you'd want to initialize this schema. So it is able to understand whether your database is embedded or not. So it sees, okay, you're using an embedded database, so you'd want to initialize the database. So it uses Hibernate property called create drop. So it creates the schema at application launch up and drops the schema when the application is terminated. That's number one. The other auto configuration stuff that is enabled is Hibernate JPA auto configuration. Because we have Hibernate on the class path, Hibernate JPA auto configuration is triggered. Other things which are auto configured are a data source. There's a data source which is auto configured, and entity manager factory is auto configured, and the transaction manager is auto configured. If you actually look through the log, there are a lot of other stuff which is auto configured by Spring Boot. What we are looking at are some of the important things that are auto configured from the perspective of JPA and Hibernate. Auto configuration is a very important feature of Spring Boot. Spring Boot, what it does is it looks at the classes which are available in the class path. It looks at the jars which are available in the class path, and it decides what is the best configuration for you. For us, it decided that because H2 is in the class path, because Hibernate is in the class path, I'm going to use Hibernate with JPA. So I'm going to use Hibernate as the default implementation for JPA, and it also decided that I would want to use H2 as the in-memory database, and it auto configured the schema for me and also auto configured the entity manager, the data source, and the transaction manager for us. So all this happened in the background, and that's why when we ran the application, we were able to easily execute the queries against the database and insert a user row into the database. In this step, we were trying to answer the important questions. Where is the database created? What schema is used? What are the tables created? How can we see the data in the database? How are we getting Hibernate data source and all other stuff? We saw that the answer to all of this is Spring Boot and the in-memory database H2. We had to do no project setup, no configuration at all. Using an in-memory database, we don't really need to maintain anything. I don't really need to install a database or something of this kind. This makes it a great combination for learning and for writing unit tests. The other important thing is with little configuration, with some simple configuration in the application.properties, we can actually really connect to a SQL database or an Oracle database. The only problem with using an in-memory database is the fact that the data is not persistent between restarts. So as soon as you terminate the application, the entire schema and the data is lost. In this course, at the start, we would start using an in-memory database because of all the flexibilities it provides. In the last few steps, we created an entity called user and we started managing it with user service. Let's say I want to create another entity. What I would need to do in that kind of a situation is to manage it. I would need to again go and create another DAO service. So let's say I would want to create another entity. So some entity DAO service, and to insert here I would say some entity, and let's just call this entity. Way you are writing a user DAO service is very similar to some other entity DAO service. So here we are just inserting the data, but consider the scenario when I'm inserting, I'm retrieving data, I'm deleting, updating, and all that kind of stuff. So if I have a lot of methods here, then those kind of methods are repeated again and again for all the different entities. If I have 15 entities, I would have 15 DAO services which would be having very similar logic. So irrespective of the entity, you have to interact with the entity manager to manage it. So you have to either call a persist method, or you would have to call something like a merge method, or you would need to call a remove method, or you have to call one of the variations of the find methods. Spring Data wants to solve that problem. What Spring Data says is you just define your interfaces. You define your repository interfaces and I will take care of implementing them. So if I want to just do a user DAO service, instead of that I can create a simple repository with a small method in the interface, and Spring Data says I'll provide the implementation for you. I'll be able to talk to the entity manager and do what you would want. The specific implementation or the specific module for JPA is Spring Data JPA. Let's now use Spring Data JPA to create a simple repository. The way we do that is very simple. All that we need to say is file, new, interface. The most important thing is we are creating just a simple interface. We are not going to provide the implementation. The implementation would be provided by Spring Data JPA. With this interface, we need to implement or extend actually another interface which is present inside the Spring Data JPA, which is JPA repository. So input the JPA repository. When we are extending the JPA repository, we need to provide what is the entity that you would want to manage. The entity we would want to manage is user. I would want to manage user, and the other thing I would need to provide is the primary key. The primary key of user is long. This is all you would need to be able to create a repository. Now, I would want to use this repository from our command line runner. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create another command line runner. I'm copying the user DAO service. I would actually call this now user repository command line runner because it uses the user repository. I'll open up the user repository command line runner. I would want to change this. I would not want to use user DAO service. I would want to use user repository now. So import user repository. Instead of Jack, I would want, let's say, insert Jill from here. I'll use the user repository dot save and say user. One important thing about the user repository is the fact that whether you want to update or insert, you would use the same method, which is save. This would actually return a user back. I would not need to worry about it. So I'll say user repository dot save user. Let's now run the application and see what happens. So I'll stop this and start the application. You would see that the insert queries are fired twice because we have two runners. We have one runner which is making use of the DAO service, the other runner which is making use of the user repository. And you would see that new user is created would be printed twice. You can see that Jill is also now created. What we did in this step is actually we used a simple user repository instead of a user DAO service. The user repository kind of acts as a shortcut to manage your entities. Instead of writing a lot of DAO services with very similar logic, so you would have the same insert persist logic, merge logic, find, and all that kind of stuff. Instead of using that kind of logic, Spring Data JPA provides a common abstraction called JPA repository. If you extend the JPA repository and provide the entity you would want to manage, you would get all the different methods that are provided, a varied range of methods that are provided for doing all kind of operations with your entities. In this step, we looked at one of the operations that was present. What we did from the user repository command line runner is we made use of the save method. What we'll do in the next step is make use of more methods that are defined in Spring Data JPA. Until the next step, bye-bye. Spring Data JPA makes it easy to manage your entities. Once you have defined your entities and defined the mapping to the database, that's it. Spring Data Repository would provide a lot of useful methods to manage them. In the previous step, we made use of this save method. Let's start with using a few more methods. One of the important methods which is present in the user repository dot find. So if I want to find by ID, I can use the method find by ID. And you can see that the find by ID uses a long. So I'll say I'd want to find the user who has an ID 1 and assign it to a local variable. This actually returns an optional. So I'll say user with ID 1. And I would say user is not created, but this is actually retrieved. So I've got the user who has the ID 1 retrieved from the database. The other options user repository provides is to query all users. So let's say dot find all, and I'll assign this to a list, and let's call it users, and let's also log all users plus. We are using a couple of methods from the user repository. Actually, user repository has a lot of other methods. So you'd see that user repository has a count method, a delete method. You can actually delete in batch, and you can check whether something exists or not. You can do wide variety of searches using find, and also you have methods to save. So save method is used to insert and also to update an entity. There are a wide variety of methods that are there in the user repository. I would recommend you to try and see what are the methods that are there and try to play around with them. For now, let's restrict ourselves for these two things and let's start running the application. I'll stop this and start it again. The application will take a while to launch up because we have put it in debug mode. So now it's completed execution. If you look at the log, you'd see a few things that are printed. So one of the things which is printed is user is retrieved. So we are able to retrieve the user with ID 1. The name is Jack and we see the role is admin. And also we see all users printed in the log. So all users, user with ID 1 and ID 2. So we are able to retrieve all the users back. We saw how user repository is very useful in simplifying interactions with the entities, in managing entities. So now with Spring Data JPA, all that we need to do is define the entities. So once you have defined entities, Spring Data JPA makes it really easy to manage those entities. Until next step, bye bye.